November 20, 1943. Tarawa Atoll. The sun blazed mercilessly over the Pacific, turning the lagoon into a mirror of fire. The air trembled with the roar of naval guns, each blast hammering the tiny island of Bushidō, a strip of coral barely 3 miles long. Smoke drifted upward in black ribbons. Beneath it, hundreds of Japanese defenders waited in their bunkers, gripping rifles slick with sweat. They had sworn to die rather than yield a single inch. Then, through the haze, shapes began to emerge from the surf. Marines, hundreds of them, wading chest-deep through water, turned red. Machine gun fire ripped through the ranks, yet they kept advancing. No shouting, no panic, just grim, mechanical movement toward the beach. Japanese gunners watched in disbelief. Their fire was cutting men down by the dozens. Yet the Americans would not stop. They called them sea demons, soldiers who rose from the ocean and kept coming no matter how many fell. This was the moment Japan began to understand fighting the United States Marines was unlike facing any other enemy on Earth. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, Imperial Japan seemed unstoppable. In just months, its forces swept through Southeast Asia, the Philippines and the Pacific Islands with terrifying speed. Pearl Harbor had shattered America's sense of security, and every victory emboldened Tokyo's belief in its divine mission to dominate the Pacific and crush Western influence in Asia. At the heart of this empire was a warrior creed, Bushidō, the ancient code of the samurai. It glorified sacrifice and loyalty unto death. The Japanese soldier, the IJA infantryman, or the SNLF Marine, was trained to view surrender as the ultimate disgrace. To die for the emperor was honor itself. Every battle was a spiritual test. But in Washington, far across the ocean, a different kind of warrior was being prepared, one not born of feudal ideals but forged through discipline, technology, and relentless adaptation. The United States Marine Corps, a small, often overlooked branch before the war, was suddenly thrust into the role of America's spearhead. After Pearl Harbor, the Marines were tasked with an impossible mission: take back the Pacific, one island at a time. To do so, they had to invent a new kind of warfare: amphibious assault. They trained to storm beaches under fire, coordinate naval gunfire with infantry movement, and survive in brutal alien environments. Every operation was a rehearsal for hell. By 1942, both sides began to collide in the vast ocean, in places most Americans had never heard of. The first test came at Guadalcanal. When the Marines landed there in August 1942, they met an enemy unlike any they had faced in Europe or North Africa. The Japanese fought to the last man. They infiltrated at night, launched suicidal bayonet charges, and refused to retreat even when hopelessly outnumbered. Yet the Marines held. They fought in mud and jungle, half-starved, surrounded, sleepless for weeks. Their commanders, like General Alexander Vandergrift, learned fast that this war wasn't about territory alone. It was about endurance, mentality, and sheer willpower. The Japanese had expected another easy victory. Instead, they found an opponent who fought with the same ferocity, but without the same code. The Marines weren't bound by notions of ritual death or divine service. Their strength came from training, camaraderie, and the unbreakable belief in survival, theirs and their brothers. Reports began circulating among Japanese officers. The Americans fought like beasts, unshaken by casualties, relentless in attack, and terrifying in defense. At Guadalcanal, Japanese units of 10,000 dwindled to fewer than 2,000 survivors. It was the first time the Empire's army had been decisively beaten on land. Across the Pacific, word spread. To the Japanese High Command, the Marines were not just another enemy. They were a psychological threat, brutal, efficient, and dishonorable by traditional standards. They refused to die when expected to, refused to surrender when surrounded, and refused to give mercy when attacked. But Guadalcanal was only the beginning. In the months that followed, the US began assembling a juggernaut of industrial and military power. The Navy built amphibious fleets capable of carrying entire divisions across oceans. The Marines refined every aspect of beach landings, from logistics to naval coordination. They studied tides, coral reefs, and wind patterns, turning nature itself into a weapon. Japan, meanwhile, was stretched thin. Its empire spanned thousands of miles, defended by isolated garrisons with dwindling supplies. Yet each garrison was ordered to fight to extinction. No surrender, no retreat. To the men of the rising sun, to die fighting was still the only honorable end. That collision of cultures, one glorifying death, the other perfecting survival, would define every battle that followed. And soon, on a coral island called Tarawa, that collision would erupt into a nightmare that neither side would ever forget. By mid-1943, the Pacific had shifted. The United States, awakened and rearmed, was no longer reacting to Japan's onslaught. It was on the offensive. From the Solomons to the Gilberts, the island-hopping campaign was taking shape, a grand design to advance toward Tokyo by seizing strategic outposts one by one. At the tip of this offensive stood the United States Marine Corps. What had once been a small expeditionary force now swelled into a lethal instrument of amphibious warfare. Every Marine division trained with a singular purpose to land under fire, establish a beachhead, and annihilate the enemy. They were not built for defense, but for forward motion, aggressive, disciplined, and methodical. Marine training was brutal. Recruits were stripped of individuality, molded into a body that moved as one. They drilled through live fire, practiced assaulting mock beaches, and endured endless physical punishment. The doctrine was clear. Hesitation meant death. The Pacific would not forgive weakness. The Japanese, watching these moves from afar, prepared their own countermeasure. The Imperial General Staff issued a new defensive doctrine: delay, attrition, and death. Every island was to be fortified as a fortress. Caves were expanded into networks of tunnels. Pillboxes and bunkers were carved into coral and volcanic rock. Each garrison was ordered to inflict maximum American casualties before dying in place. But there was a flaw. Japan had overextended. Its troops were brave, but supplies were short. Ammunition, food, and even medical resources were dwindling. The empire's outer islands became isolated pockets, doomed outposts cut off by American submarines and air power. Still, Japanese commanders clung to faith in their soldiers' spiritual superiority. They believed their courage could overcome American technology. The samurai spirit, they said, would defeat the Western machine. They underestimated what the Marines had become. By late 1943, the Marines' amphibious tactics were unmatched. Assault waves coordinated perfectly with naval bombardment. Tanks, flamethrowers, engineers, and air support moved as one organism. Every element, from the landing craft coxswain to the rifleman, had a role. When the beach was taken, logistics flowed behind them like a living artery. And unlike Japanese forces, who often fought in isolated units, the Marines mastered communication. Radios linked every level of command, orders flowed, support arrived, and the machine kept advancing. In Tokyo, intercepted reports began painting a grim picture. Japanese troops at Guadalcanal and Buna had fought valiantly, but they died faster than replacements could reach them. Their bravery had become waste, consumed by an enemy that never stopped learning. Then came Tarawa, the first test of Japan's new defensive doctrine, and the moment both sides realized what this war had become. Tarawa was tiny, just a speck in the Gilbert Islands, but heavily fortified by over 4,500 Japanese defenders under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki. He declared that it would take 1,000,000 men 1,000 years to capture Betio. When the Marines landed, they proved him wrong, but at a staggering cost. The battle lasted only 76 hours. In that time, nearly every Japanese soldier was killed. The Marines suffered over 3,000 casualties. Beaches were littered with bodies. The lagoon choked with wrecked landing craft. When the news reached Japan, it struck like thunder. The garrison had fought to the death, as ordered, yet the Americans had taken the island in 3 days. Shibasaki's prediction had been crushed by the very willpower he thought Japan alone possessed. The Imperial Command began to understand the Americans were not soft, they were not cowards hiding behind machines. Their Marines were a new breed of warrior, disciplined, fearless, and seemingly immune to the terror of death. Letters recovered from Japanese soldiers after Tarawa spoke of disbelief. They wrote of enemies who walked through bullets, who kept advancing when they should have fallen. The word Oni demon appeared again and again. That fear spread through the ranks, long before Iwo Jima and Okinawa. In the years to come, it would only deepen, as island after island fell under the relentless tide of green uniforms and steel. For the Japanese, this was no longer a war of conquest. It was a war against something they could not understand. And to understand why they hated fighting the Marines most of all, we must look beyond the battles themselves, into the minds, the methods, and the machines that defined them. To understand why the Japanese came to hate and fear fighting the US Marines above all others, we must look through several lenses: human, psychological, and cultural, because it was not merely a clash of armies, but of identities. The average American Marine who stepped onto a Pacific beach in 1943 was young, often 19 or 20, yet forged through one of the harshest military systems in the world. Marine boot camp was designed not to train but to transform. Recruits were stripped of comfort, individuality, and hesitation. Drill instructors instilled in them the singular rule: never stop advancing. Each Marine learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. They were taught to endure exhaustion, thirst, and heat without complaint, to obey instantly, to kill without hesitation. And unlike the Imperial Japanese Army, which emphasized death before surrender, the Marines trained to fight until victory, to live, not die, for their brothers beside them. In every squad, camaraderie was sacred. Marines didn't fight for generals or flags. They fought for the man next to them. That bond made them terrifyingly resilient. A wounded Marine might crawl forward instead of back, covering his fire team as long as he could breathe. To the Japanese soldier, raised in rigid hierarchy and indoctrinated to sacrifice himself in the name of the emperor, this spirit of unity was alien. They saw it not as loyalty but as madness. Men who refused to die even when doomed, men who fought for one another rather than ideology. This, more than any weapon, defined the Marine on the battlefield. From 1942 onward, Japanese propaganda began to portray the US Marines as monsters. Leaflets and radio broadcasts called them sea devils, American beasts, and cowards who hide behind machines. They were described as lacking honor, killing from afar, relying on artillery and tanks rather than facing the enemy with the sword. But when the Japanese actually faced them, the image fractured. Marines did not flinch in close combat. They met banzai charges head-on, firing until barrels glowed red. They used bayonets, grenades, and fists with equal ferocity. To many Japanese officers, this defiance was an insult to their warrior tradition. Japanese soldiers were taught that Westerners feared death, that they would flee when confronted with suicidal bravery. But at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Peleliu, they saw Marines charging fortified bunkers through machine gun fire, storming positions under artillery, refusing to retreat even when surrounded. For a culture that equated courage with self-sacrifice, it was incomprehensible. The Americans were supposed to fear dying. Instead, they seemed indifferent to it. The psychological shock was immense. Reports from surviving Japanese officers described Marines as invulnerable, cold, and inhuman. Prisoners captured later in the war often admitted that their morale collapsed not because of firepower, but because the enemy would not stop. In every war, fear evolves. For the Japanese in the Pacific, fear turned into hatred. It was easier to despise what terrified them. The Marines represented a mirror image of their own code: disciplined, ruthless, and unyielding. They fought without hesitation, but not for divine cause, only survival. To the Japanese mind, this made them unpredictable. You could not reason with them through honor. You could not defeat them by showing greater bravery, because they did not play by the same moral rules. The battlefield psychology between both forces spiraled into mutual dehumanization. Marines hardened by atrocities they witnessed, ambushes, fake surrenders, mutilations of comrades, began to see Japanese soldiers not as men but as targets. The Japanese, indoctrinated by years of propaganda, saw the Marines as subhuman invaders. This toxic cycle stripped the war of mercy. Captives were rarely taken. The wounded were executed. Each battle became an extermination. And yet, underneath that hatred, something else emerged: respect. Japanese veterans later admitted that the Marines' discipline reminded them of the samurai ethos they had been taught. They recognized in the Americans a reflection of their own spirit, brutal, determined, but human. It was that paradox, fear, hate, and reluctant admiration, that made the Japanese dread facing Marines more than any other Allied force. Every Japanese garrison from 1943 onward carried stories of Tarawa and Guadalcanal like warnings from ghosts. They knew what the green uniforms meant. They knew what would come when the horizon filled with American ships. And in the next stage of the war, that dread would only grow, as the Marines refined their tactics, embraced superior technology, and turned the Pacific into a theater of precise, methodical annihilation. What set the US Marines apart from other Allied units was not only their courage but their method. Every landing was a choreography of destruction. Nothing was left to improvisation. By 1943, amphibious assaults had evolved into a science, the synchronization of sea, land, and air into a single strike. Each operation began with hours of aerial reconnaissance, mapping beaches, tides, and fortifications. Engineers analyzed sand composition for vehicle movement. Naval gunfire plans were drawn down to the minute. When the assault began, waves of landing craft moved with machine-like precision, every coxswain, every rifleman knowing his position in the chaos. Unlike Japanese tactics, which often relied on static defense and human sacrifice, the Marines fought dynamically. If a landing went wrong, squad leaders took initiative. If communications failed, the mission continued through instinct and training. Every Marine was expected to think, act, and adapt. This flexibility broke Japanese expectations. Their doctrine was designed to exploit hesitation, to terrify and overwhelm an enemy who paused. But the Marines didn't pause. They advanced through artillery, through fire, through walls of bullets. Their small unit coordination was unmatched. Fire teams flanked bunkers with flamethrowers, while machine guns laid suppressive fire. Engineers cleared mines while tanks rolled forward. It was controlled brutality, efficient, systematic, relentless. For the Japanese, accustomed to enemies who broke under shock, this methodical storm was incomprehensible. To them, it was not strategy, it was mechanical death. Behind the Marines stood a machine unlike any the world had ever seen, the full industrial might of the United States. Each Marine landing was supported by floating cities of steel, aircraft carriers, cruisers, battleships, and transports stretching across the horizon. Artillery fire came from miles offshore. Dive bombers roared overhead, softening targets with precision unheard of in 1942. Japan, by contrast, fought with dwindling fuel, shrinking fleets, and obsolete equipment. Their troops were brave but isolated, cut off from reinforcement or resupply. Even their weapons, the Arisaka rifle, the light Nambu machine gun, were outmatched by the Marines' Garands, Bayars, and Browning .50 caliber guns. Then came the tools of terror, flamethrowers and demolition charges. To Japanese soldiers hiding in caves or bunkers, these weapons were nightmares given form. Fire crawled through tunnels, consuming everything. The psychological effect was devastating. Survivors spoke of heat so intense it melted steel helmets. Marines also pioneered amphibious armor, the LVT Alligator and the amphibious Sherman. These vehicles rolled over coral and craters, crushing Japanese defenses once considered impenetrable. To defenders, it seemed as if the ocean itself had turned against them. Technology amplified the Marines' doctrine: strike hard, move fast, and never let the enemy recover. In this equation, bravery alone was worthless. Japan learned that no amount of spirit could stop mechanized precision. War strips away philosophy, yet in the Pacific, it also exposed the limits of it. The Japanese fought with the conviction that dying for the emperor purified the soul. The Marines fought with the conviction that living for victory honored the fallen. To the Japanese, surrender was shame. To the Marines, surrender was intelligence. This difference shaped every encounter. Japanese troops often chose suicide over capture. Marines, seeing this, hardened. They learned that mercy often led to ambush. Soon they stopped expecting surrender altogether. By 1944, the Pacific War had become a moral wasteland. Both sides fought without restraint. Civilians suffered, prisoners vanished, and the human cost became incalculable. Yet within that darkness, the Marines found purpose, a grim determination to end the war as quickly as possible. They knew every island conquered meant thousands fewer lives lost on the next. They fought not for glory, but for survival, and for those who would follow them home. The Japanese could not comprehend this mindset. They mistook it for cruelty, but beneath it lay something profoundly human, the refusal to die needlessly. Over time, even Japanese officers began to understand. Some captured at Saipan and Okinawa admitted respect for the Marines' discipline and skill. They saw in them not monsters but equals, enemies bound by duty, shaped by different worlds. The Marines had become everything Japan feared, the embodiment of endurance, technology, and unrelenting will. To face them was to confront inevitability, not a single enemy, but an unstoppable tide of men and machines. And by 1944, that tide would crash into the very heart of Japan's island defenses, in battles where hatred, bravery, and endurance reached their ultimate test. November 20th, 1943. Bushidō Island, Tarawa Atoll. The sea was calm at dawn, a deceptive stillness before the storm. On the decks of U.S. Navy transports, 18,000 Marines prepared to make history and to step into hell. For months, the planners had studied every grain of coral, every tide chart, every photograph. Yet no amount of preparation could change what awaited them. The Japanese had turned the island into a fortress, concrete bunkers, steel pillboxes, and interlocking fields of fire. Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had promised Tokyo that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 1,000 years. When the bombardment began, it seemed as if the world itself was ending. Battleships and cruisers unleashed a storm of shells that flattened palm trees and churned the sand into ash. Smoke and flames swallowed the island. Marines watching from landing craft believed no living thing could have survived. Then the shelling stopped. Silence, brief, heavy, absolute. The assault waves began to move. But the tides betrayed them. Many landing craft struck hidden coral reefs hundreds of yards from shore. Amphibious tractors, LVTs, pushed ahead, but hundreds of Marines were forced to wade through chest-deep water under direct fire. Japanese machine guns, untouched in concrete bunkers, opened up. The lagoon turned red. What followed was 3 days of horror. Entire units were cut down before reaching the sand. Communications broke down. Officers fell, and chaos consumed the beachhead. Yet the Marines did not stop. One by one, squads crawled forward, taking shelter behind bodies, craters, and wrecked tanks. Engineers moved up with explosives and flamethrowers. The assault became a series of duels fought at point-blank range, bunker to bunker, grenade to grenade. The Japanese fought with suicidal determination. Snipers in palm trunks, machine gunners firing until flames consumed their positions. Officers leading banzai charges into walls of bullets. But the Marines matched them, inch for inch. When ammunition ran low, they used bayonets, knives, and bare hands. By the end of the second day, Bushidō was a wasteland, a smoking ruin littered with thousands of dead. The stench of salt, cordite, and blood hung over the lagoon. Yet the American flag rose above the shattered command post on the third morning. Out of 4,500 Japanese defenders, fewer than 20 were taken alive. The rest lay buried in the coral or burned in their bunkers. The Marines had paid an unimaginable price, over 3,000 casualties in just 76 hours. But the island was theirs. For Japan, Tarawa was more than a loss. It was a revelation. The Bushidō myth had met its equal. The Americans had fought with the same disregard for death, but with precision and technology that multiplied their power 100-fold. The Imperial High Command struggled to comprehend how such a small island could fall so quickly, and at such cost to the attackers, who refused to retreat or surrender even under impossible conditions. In Tokyo, the news was received with disbelief. How could men from a nation of supposed decadence, men raised in comfort, fight with such ferocity? Officers spoke in whispers of the demon Marines. soldiers who advanced through fire as if possessed. Letters later found in abandoned Japanese outposts carried the same tone. The enemy is terrifying. They do not fear death. They are beasts who fight like machines. But among the Marines, Tarawa became a grim legend, a lesson written in blood. They had won, but barely. They knew the next islands would be worse. The Corps studied every mistake, the tide miscalculations, the communication breakdowns, the bottlenecks on the beach. Within months, they transformed those failures into doctrine. The next landings at Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu would show an evolution so rapid it stunned even their own commanders. For the Japanese, Tarawa marked a turning point of another kind. They realized that no amount of fortification could stop what was coming. The Americans were learning faster, adapting harder, and bringing the full weight of an industrial superpower to bear. And as 1944 dawned, the war in the Pacific entered its most brutal phase, one defined not by distance or strategy, but by survival itself. Ahead lay Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the Japanese would meet the full fury of the Marines, and where their hatred would turn to something darker, hopelessness. By early 1945, the Pacific was closing in on Japan like a tightening fist. The great island fortresses that once formed the outer ring of the empire had fallen one after another. The Philippines were burning, the Marianas gone, and the sea route strangled by American submarines. But ahead lay two names that would burn themselves into history: Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These were not just battles, they were reckonings. February 19, 1945, dawn. From the decks of U.S. transports, Marines gazed toward a black volcanic island shrouded in mist. Iwo Jima, 8 square miles of rock, ash and sulfur fumes. Beneath that barren surface, 21,000 Japanese soldiers under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi waited in silence. Kuribayashi was no fool. He knew the Americans were coming, and he knew he could not win. His goal was simple: to make them bleed so heavily that America would question the price of invasion. When the bombardment ended and the Marines landed, the silence held. For a moment, they believed the enemy was dead. Then the island erupted. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery burst from invisible holes. The beach became a killing ground. The Marines fought through sand that clung to boots like tar. Tanks bogged down. Air support was blind in the smoke. The Japanese had turned Iwo Jima into a labyrinth. Miles of tunnels, hidden bunkers, command posts carved into rock. Every inch had to be taken by hand. It was combat stripped to its core, close, choking, and personal. Flamethrowers cleared caves. Grenades bounced down tunnels. Casualties mounted by the thousands. But the Marines did not falter. Units cut off from command still pressed forward. Corpsmen crawled under fire to drag the wounded back. When the flag was raised atop Mount Suribachi on February 23rd, it became more than a victory. It was a symbol of endurance, seen by a nation weary of war. For Japan, the loss of Iwo Jima was devastating. Every defender but a few hundred died, yet they had inflicted over 26,000 American casualties. Kuribayashi's sacrifice had proven his theory correct. But it also confirmed Japan's worst fear: even unimaginable losses could not stop the Marines. 2 months later came Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Over 500,000 American troops, including 180,000 Marines, landed on an island considered Japan's last line of defense. Waiting for them were 100,000 Japanese soldiers, commanded by General Mitsuru Ushijima, and among them countless civilians trapped between duty and despair. At first, the landings were easy. Beaches were captured with minimal resistance. Some Marines began to hope the island would fall quickly. Then the trap closed. Japanese forces had withdrawn into the southern hills, forming an immense defensive network. Artillery rained from concealed ridges. Suicide attacks from the air, kamikaze strikes, tore into the American fleet offshore. Entire ships were lost in fire and oil. On land, the Marines advanced yard by yard through rain, mud, and rotting corpses. It was war beyond exhaustion. The Japanese fought not to win, but to destroy, to take as many lives as possible before dying. Caves had to be cleared one by one. Every night brought infiltration attacks, grenades tossed into foxholes, screams in the dark. The Marines responded with the full weight of their doctrine. Tanks, flamethrowers, and demolition teams moved in relentless coordination. Where the enemy hid, they burned him out. The battle lasted nearly 3 months. When it ended, Okinawa was a graveyard. 12,000 Americans dead, 100,000 Japanese soldiers gone, and tens of thousands of civilians caught in between. For Japan, the psychological impact was irreversible. If this was what the Marines could do so close to home, what would happen when they reached the mainland? Every soldier knew the answer. To fight the Americans, the Marines especially, was to face annihilation. By mid-1945, hatred had turned to resignation. Japanese diaries recovered after Okinawa revealed an eerie calm. They are stronger than us. They fight like we once dreamed to fight. It was no longer about pride or honor. It was survival. Officers began to recognize that America's Marines had mastered the very qualities Japan once claimed as its own: discipline, sacrifice, and unyielding courage. But where Japan worshipped death, the Marines worshipped persistence. Even Emperor Hirohito, briefed on Okinawa's losses, saw the truth. Japan's spirit could no longer match America's power, nor its will. It was this realization, as much as the atomic bomb, that broke Japan's resolve to continue the war. The Marines had not only conquered islands, they had shattered an idea, the myth of the invincible Japanese warrior. When the guns fell silent, the Pacific was a sea of ruins, yet amid the devastation, a strange respect had formed, born not from mercy, but from mutual recognition. The Japanese had hated fighting the Marines because they had seen in them the reflection of their own ideals, stripped of ritual, refined into something pure and terrifying. And in the ashes of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, that reflection would define how both nations remembered the cost of courage. When the guns fell silent over the Pacific in August 1945, Japan lay shattered, its cities burned, its armies broken, its people exhausted beyond imagination. Yet beneath the rubble something more profound had been destroyed, the spiritual foundation upon which the Japanese military had built its identity for decades. The samurai myth, that unyielding belief in death before dishonor, had been tested against an enemy that did not seek glory through dying, but through enduring. The American Marines, with their tenacity, organization, and willingness to take unimaginable punishment and still advance, had rewritten what courage meant on the battlefield. For years, Japanese officers had been trained to believe that Western soldiers, once met with ferocity, would retreat. The early months of the war, the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies had seemed to prove them right. But in the jungles of Guadalcanal, the coral ridges of Peleliu, and the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, they found an enemy who did not break, no matter how many died. That discovery struck deep. In post-war interrogations, captured Japanese officers admitted their astonishment. One colonel confessed, "We thought Americans were soft. The Marines showed us otherwise. They never stopped coming." The phrase "never stopped coming" became an echo across Japanese memoirs. It captured the very essence of the Marine fighting spirit, a willpower that could not be measured in weapons or numbers, but in the sheer refusal to yield. Within the Allied ranks, the Marines' reputation grew into legend. Reports from the Pacific filtered back to Washington, painting vivid pictures of men advancing through hellish firestorms, dragging comrades from burning beaches, and storming caves that had already consumed battalions before them. To the American public, the Marines became a symbol of determination, ordinary men achieving the impossible through grit and unity. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi wasn't just a moment of victory, it was the face of the war itself. Newspapers carried the image, and across the nation, it gave shape to the sacrifice being made in distant islands few could find on a map. For Japan, that same image cut the other way. It represented the end of their dream of dominance. The empire that had once prided itself on producing the world's fiercest warriors now faced an adversary who had mastered the art of relentless survival. Even within the imperial army, whispers began to circulate in the war's final months that the Marines were the most feared of all Allied troops. Their amphibious assaults, their precision, their brutal efficiency All these traits made them the ultimate nightmare for any Japanese garrison. The cumulative effect of those encounters was psychological collapse. The Japanese soldier's belief in his own invincibility was systematically dismantled, island by island. After Okinawa, intelligence officers reported intercepted letters from Japanese troops preparing for the homeland defense. Some wrote of pride, others of despair, but the theme was consistent: fear of the Marines. Not the bombers, not the Navy, not even the atomic threat yet to come, but the thought of facing Marines on Japanese soil. The Marines had become, in Japanese minds, a force that could not be stopped. A Japanese staff officer later remarked, "We feared them because they fought without hate. They fought to finish." This observation captured something essential, that the Marines' resolve came not from rage or vengeance, but from purpose. Their fight was methodical, organized, almost mechanical, but behind it was a deep, unspoken bond among men who refused to let each other fall. By the war's end, that bond had forged a new archetype of the warrior, one not born from centuries of tradition, but from shared hardship and collective endurance. The Marines had created a culture of strength through unity, a stark contrast to the Japanese doctrine of isolated sacrifice. As Japan prepared to surrender, these realizations hung heavily over the remnants of its military elite. They had lost not only the war but also the moral high ground they believed they owned. The mirror of the Pacific showed them what courage truly looked like, and it wasn't suicide for honor, it was survival for the sake of those beside you. And that understanding, painful as it was, would shape the post-war relationship between the two nations in ways neither side could have imagined. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, did more than end the Pacific War. It began a reckoning with the myths that had driven it. The once proud military that believed in divine destiny now faced the humiliation of defeat and occupation. Yet even amid that collapse, the respect for the Marines remained, a grudging, almost reverential acknowledgement that these men had embodied everything Japan had once admired about itself. In the early years after the war, surviving Japanese officers began writing memoirs and reports for Allied intelligence. Many described their shock at the Marine Corps' endurance. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's letters from Iwo Jima, discovered after his death, expressed admiration cloaked in disbelief. "The enemy fights with exceptional spirit," he wrote. "Even when surrounded, they resist to the end." Kuribayashi had understood what most of Japan's high command could not, that the American strength was not born from fanaticism, but from discipline and faith in one another. It was a different kind of loyalty, built not on hierarchy or divine purpose, but on shared trust between soldiers. As Japan rebuilt under American occupation, that same spirit, teamwork, efficiency, resilience, became the foundation of its recovery. The very qualities the Japanese had feared in their enemies now became virtues to emulate in peace. The hatred that had once fueled the war slowly transformed into respect. Japanese historians began to study the Marines, not as foes but as examples of modern military excellence. Their tactics, leadership structure, and emphasis on adaptability became subjects in military academies worldwide. For the United States, the Pacific Campaign redefined the Marine Corps forever. Before the war, they had been a small, specialized branch of the military. By the end, they were an institution revered for their toughness and unity. The island battles had written the Corps' identity in blood, and that identity became a national legend. The Marines' ethos, no better friend, no worse enemy, was born from the Pacific. It was forged by men who had fought not just the Japanese, but the limits of human endurance. The legacy of Iwo Jima, Tarawa, Peleliu, and Okinawa became sacred ground in marine history, taught, remembered, and revered. And while Japan rebuilt its cities, the Marines carried those lessons into every future war, from Korea to Vietnam, Iraq to Afghanistan. The memory of their Pacific struggle became a compass for every generation that followed. Time, however, does strange things to memory. When American veterans returned to Japan decades later, some as tourists, others as participants in memorial ceremonies, they found something unexpected: respect. On the black sands of Iwo Jima, Japanese and American veterans once stood side by side, their hands trembling as they exchanged salutes. There were no speeches, no slogans, only silence. In that silence, the hatred of the past dissolved into shared understanding. Both sides had been victims of their own convictions. Both had fought with absolute devotion. Both had suffered losses beyond comprehension. For the Japanese, the Marines had come to represent the purity of the warrior spirit, not bound to death, but to duty. For the Americans, the Japanese had reminded them of what happens when courage becomes consumed by ideology. Between them lay the most brutal chapter of human conflict, and perhaps the deepest mutual respect born from it. Today, when historians speak of the Pacific War, they often describe it not as a clash of nations, but as a clash of philosophies of courage. On one side stood a nation that saw death as the ultimate act of honor. On the other, a force that found honor in perseverance and brotherhood. The Japanese hated fighting the Marines because the Marines broke every assumption they had about the West, and in doing so, exposed the limits of their own ideals. It was not hatred of cruelty or cowardice. It was hatred born of recognition, of seeing in the Marines a reflection of their own spirit, perfected in a different form. And that realization, that courage could exist without surrender, that discipline could thrive without dogma, would shape how Japan and America viewed war, honor, and humanity for generations to come. From hatred came respect. From fire came understanding. And from the beaches of the Pacific rose a new kind of warrior, not defined by death, but by the unbreakable will to live, fight, and endure. War leaves marks that neither maps nor numbers can fully capture. In the Pacific, those marks were written not only in ash and coral, but in the hearts of men, Japanese and American alike. The battles between the US Marines and the Imperial Japanese forces were more than contests of firepower. They were contests of endurance, spirit, and the will to survive. The Japanese hated fighting the Marines because they faced an enemy who defied their deepest expectations. These were soldiers who advanced through fire, who refused to yield, and who thrived not on ideology, but on discipline and loyalty to one another. To the Japanese, this made the Marines something unnatural, something unstoppable, a force that would not honor death in the same way, yet seemed more invincible for it. Yet in that hatred lay a strange form of respect. By surviving Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the Marines demonstrated that courage was not a matter of ritual, but of purpose. They embodied a kind of human resilience that could bend, adapt, and endure without breaking. And through that endurance, they transformed the very nature of combat in the Pacific, redefining what a warrior could be. For Japan, this confrontation forced a reckoning with its own ideals. The samurai code of honor and the glorification of death had met a living, breathing counterpart, one that fought with precision, patience, and relentless will. The realization was bitter, but it planted the seeds of understanding that strength need not come from sacrifice alone, but from unity, persistence, and the courage to survive for others. In the quiet years after the war, when veterans from both sides met again on those same black sands, the hatred had softened. Only respect remained, an acknowledgement that the fiercest battles were not won solely by firepower, but by the unbreakable human spirit. The Marines had become more than soldiers. They were a mirror, a lesson, a reminder that in the crucible of war, humanity endures not only through courage, but through connection, resolve, and the will to rise again, even when the world seems determined to stop you. And in that reflection, the Pacific War finds its lasting echo, that courage in its truest form is measured not by death, but by the unyielding choice to move forward, against any odds, against any fear.